They counted 8. Japanese naval intelligence officers, working from their headquarters in Tokyo in the autumn of 1941, maintained detailed files on every major warship in the United States Navy. They knew the American carrier force with precision. Lexington and Saratoga, the massive 33,000-ton conversions from battlecruiser hulls. Ranger, the first purpose-built American carrier, smaller at 14,000 tons. Yorktown, Enterprise, and Wasp, the modern fleet carriers that represented America's commitment to naval aviation. Hornet, the newest addition, commissioned just weeks before. 8 carriers. The Japanese admirals understood this number intimately. They had built their entire Pacific strategy around it. They calculated attrition rates, estimated replacement timelines, and determined that if they could sink American carriers faster than American shipyards could build them, Japan would control the Pacific for a generation. The mathematics seemed sound. Carriers took years to construct. The Americans might eventually outproduce Japan, but not quickly enough to matter. Not before Japan secured its defensive perimeter and made the cost of reconquest too high for American public opinion to bear. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. What the Japanese admirals did not know, could not know, was that American shipyards were already being transformed into something unprecedented in naval history. Production facilities that would build carriers not in years but in months. Assembly lines that would treat 30,000-ton warships like automobiles rolling off a factory floor. An industrial mobilization so vast that the 8 carriers Japan counted in 1941 would become 141 carriers by 1945. The story of how this happened, and how Japanese naval leadership came to understand what they faced, begins not with American industrial might but with Japanese confidence born from careful planning and early success. Japan had entered the era of carrier warfare earlier than most nations realized. The Japanese Navy launched Hosho in 1922, the world's first purpose-built aircraft carrier. While other navies converted battleships or experimented with aviation ships, Japan built carriers from the keel up, incorporating lessons learned and designing for operational effectiveness. By the time war came to the Pacific, Japan operated 10 carriers, Akagi and Kaga, converted from capital ships but extensively modernized. Soryu and Hiryu, purpose-built fleet carriers with balanced designs. Shokaku and Zuikaku, the newest and most capable fleet carriers in the world when completed in 1941. 4 light carriers, including Ryujo, Shoho, Zuiho, and Hosho, rounded out the force. It was a formidable fleet, built over 2 decades of careful naval expansion. Japanese carrier doctrine emphasized quality over quantity. Their pilots trained for years before being considered combat-ready. The training program was brutal. Pilots flew hundreds of hours in increasingly demanding conditions. They practiced navigation over open ocean, learning to find their carriers without radio aids. They mastered formation flying, dive bombing, and torpedo attack techniques that required split-second timing and absolute precision. By 1941, Japanese naval aviation was arguably the finest in the world. The Americans, by Japanese assessment, were adequate but not exceptional. American pilots had less training time. American aircraft, with some exceptions, were inferior to Japanese designs in key performance metrics. The Mitsubishi Zero outperformed anything the Americans flew in the Pacific in late 1941. It climbed faster, turned tighter, had longer range. Japanese torpedo bombers had better weapons. The Type 91 aerial torpedo was more reliable than American designs, ran deeper to strike below armor belts, and had a larger warhead. Japanese intelligence knew American industrial capacity was theoretically superior, but naval construction wasn't automobile production. You couldn't simply scale up carrier building the way you could increase tank output. Carriers required specialized shipyards with massive cranes and deep water access. They needed thousands of tons of armor plate rolled to precise specifications. They required complex steam propulsion systems, electrical generation plants, aviation fuel storage, ammunition magazines, all integrated into a single hull. The construction process involved hundreds of subcontractors and tens of thousands of workers with specialized skills. More importantly, carriers required time. American pre-war construction timelines bore this out. Yorktown was laid down in May 1934 and commissioned in September 1937. 3 years, and 4 months from keel laying to commissioning. Enterprise took similar time. Wasp, a smaller design, still required 2 years and 9 months, even accepting that wartime urgency might accelerate construction. Japanese planners calculated that replacing a sunk carrier would require at minimum 2 years, more realistically 3. This timeline was the foundation of Japan's entire naval strategy. If Japan could sink carriers in combat faster than America could build them, the mathematical advantage would swing decisively toward Japan. The plan required striking first, and striking hard. The attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941 was designed to cripple American battleship strength and give Japan time to consolidate its conquests. But the carriers were the real target. Intelligence had reported that American carriers were likely at Pearl Harbor. When the strike force arrived and found the carriers absent, it was a significant disappointment to Admiral Nagumo and his staff. Still, the attack achieved its broader objectives. American battleships were sunk or damaged. Japanese forces swept across the Pacific and Southeast Asia in the following months with minimal opposition. In this context of early success, Japanese admirals had every reason to believe their strategy was working. They had not sunk the American carriers at Pearl Harbor, but opportunities would come. Carriers had to sortie to be effective. When they did, Japanese naval aviation would engage them in decisive battle. The mathematics of attrition would work in Japan's favor because American shipyards, constrained by the realities of naval construction, could not possibly keep pace with combat losses. Japanese intelligence continued tracking American carriers meticulously. After Pearl Harbor, the count remained 8. All had survived. But intelligence also noted something else: construction programs. American shipyards had carriers under construction before the war began. Hornet had just been commissioned. Essex was being built at Newport News Shipbuilding in Virginia. Intelligence identified several more carriers in various stages of construction at American yards. This was expected. The Americans would try to expand their carrier force. Japanese planners incorporated this into their calculations. Perhaps America would commission 10 carriers, maybe 12 over the next 2 years. Japan would build more as well. Shinano was being constructed, converted from a Yamato-class battleship hull into what would be the largest carrier in the world. Other carriers were planned. The balance might shift somewhat, but not decisively. Not quickly enough to matter before Japan's defensive perimeter was secure. The first crack in Japanese confidence came at the Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942. American carriers Lexington and Yorktown engaged Japanese forces attempting to invade Port Moresby. The battle was tactically inconclusive, but strategically significant. Japan sank Lexington, reducing the American carrier count to 7. But the light carrier Shoho was also sunk, and Shokaku was heavily damaged, requiring months of repairs. More concerning for Japanese planners, Zuikaku's air group was so badly mauled that the carrier, though undamaged, was non-operational until replacement pilots could be trained. The battle demonstrated that carrier combat was costly for both sides, but Japanese intelligence noted something troubling in the aftermath. American carriers Hornet and Enterprise were operating in the Pacific. Wasp was in the Atlantic but could be transferred. Saratoga was under repair but would return to service. Yorktown, despite damage at Coral Sea, was reportedly being rushed back into action. The Americans were not behaving like a navy that had just lost a major fleet carrier. They were behaving like a navy with reserves. 1 month later came Midway. Japanese intelligence had counted on the element of surprise and overwhelming force. Admiral Yamamoto brought 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, against what he believed would be at most 2 or 3 American carriers. Instead, 3 American carriers were waiting: Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, the latter repaired in an impossibly short 72 hours at Pearl Harbor. The battle was catastrophic for Japan. All 4 Japanese carriers were sunk. Over 300 aircraft were lost. Hundreds of highly trained pilots and aircrew died. Worst of all, Japanese naval aviation's aura of invincibility was shattered. American dive bombers had caught Japanese carriers at their most vulnerable moment, with armed and fueled aircraft on deck, and turned them into blazing wrecks in minutes. The strategic balance had shifted dramatically. Japan now had 6 operational carriers counting light carriers. America still had 7 after Yorktown's loss at Midway, with more under construction. The attrition strategy was not working. Japanese carriers were being sunk, faster than American ones, the exact opposite of what the plan required. But Japanese intelligence officers believed the situation was recoverable. Construction programs would restore balance. Carrier combat would become less frequent as both sides rebuilt. The war would settle into the protracted defensive struggle Japan had planned for. Then the intelligence reports began arriving that made no sense. In August 1942, American carriers supported the invasion of Guadalcanal. Enterprise, Saratoga, and Wasp were identified operating in the Solomon Islands. The carrier count was holding at 7, as expected. In September, Wasp was sunk by a Japanese submarine. 6 American carriers remained operational, but intelligence reported another name. Ranger, the small pre-war carrier, was operating in the Atlantic but could redeploy, and new construction was progressing. Essex, the lead ship of a new class, was approaching commissioning. Japanese planners studied the Essex design through intelligence reports and knew it represented a significant advance over earlier American carriers. Displacing 27,000 tons standard, the Essex class was larger than anything America had built before, except the Lexington class conversions. The ships were designed for sustained operations with large air groups, extensive fuel capacity, and improved damage control systems. More concerning was the construction timeline. Intelligence indicated Essex had been laid down in April 1941 and would commission by late 1942 or early 1943, 18 to 20 months from keel to commissioning. This was faster than pre-war American carriers, but Japanese analysts noted the Americans were benefiting from wartime urgency and the fact that Essex was the lead ship of a class, allowing subsequent vessels to be built more quickly. Still, even at accelerated pace, carriers required time. The Americans might commission 1 Essex every year, perhaps 2 if they pushed their shipyards. By 1944, Japan calculated, America might operate 12 to 14 carriers total, including pre-war vessels still in service. Japan would have 8 to 10 carriers depending on construction programs and combat losses. The ratio was unfavorable, but not catastrophic. Japan could not win a protracted carrier battle, but it could make American advances so costly that a negotiated peace remained possible. This calculation was based on everything Japanese naval leadership understood about shipbuilding. It was rational, carefully reasoned, and supported by decades of naval construction experience from multiple nations. It was also completely wrong. On December 31st, 1942, Essex commissioned. Japanese intelligence noted this, 1 new American carrier, as predicted. But intelligence also reported that Yorktown, a new carrier, was fitting out. Not the Yorktown sunk at Midway, but a new Essex-class carrier, bearing the same name. And Intrepid was under construction. And Hornet, replacing the Hornet lost at Santa Cruz in October. And Lexington, replacing the Lexington lost at Coral Sea. The Americans were not just building carriers, they were building them in series, naming new ships after those lost in battle, creating an impression of immortal vessels that could not be permanently sunk. Japanese intelligence officers cross-referenced reports and confirmed that multiple Essex-class carriers were under construction simultaneously at different American shipyards. This was unexpected but not yet incomprehensible. Perhaps the Americans were straining their industrial capacity to build 4 or 5 Essex-class carriers concurrently. Such a program would be expensive and resource-intensive, but America had the capacity. The real shock came when intelligence identified not just Essex-class construction, but an entirely separate program. Independence-class light carriers. These were converted. Cruiser hulls. Smaller and faster than fleet carriers, but still capable of operating substantial air groups. Princeton, Belleau Wood, Cowpens, Monterey, Langley, Cabo, Bataan, and San Jacinto. 8 light carriers building simultaneously, with commissioning dates in 1943. Japanese analysts struggled to reconcile these numbers with their understanding of naval construction. 8 light carriers plus multiple Essex-class carriers represented a construction program of unprecedented scale, but intelligence was reliable. American shipyards were confirming these vessels existed. Photographs from reconnaissance and intelligence sources showed carriers in various stages of completion at yards across America. Then came reports of something even more incomprehensible. Escort carriers. Small carriers built on merchant ship hulls, intended for anti-submarine work and convoy protection. Dozens of them. Intelligence reports listed names: Bogue, Card, Core, Nassau, Altamaha, Barnes, Block Island. The list kept growing. These were not fleet carriers, but they were carriers nonetheless, each capable of operating aircraft, each representing industrial capacity that Japan could not match. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. By mid-1943, Japanese intelligence was tracking more American carriers than had existed in the entire world in 1941. The count had become difficult to maintain because new carriers commissioned faster than intelligence could verify and catalogue them. Essex-class carriers began commissioning at intervals of weeks, not years. Yorktown in April 1943, Intrepid in August, Hornet in November. Lexington had commissioned in February. 4 Essex-class carriers in 1 year, with more clearly visible in American shipyards. The light carriers commissioned even faster. Princeton in February, Belleau, Wood in March, Cowpens in May, Monterey in June. By December 1943, all 9 Independence-class light carriers were in commission. 9 carriers built and commissioned in less than 12 months. The escort carriers were beyond counting. Intelligence identified over 30 in service by the end of 1943, with more launching monthly. Japanese naval officers reviewing these intelligence reports faced a cognitive problem. The numbers did not make sense within any framework they understood. Carriers were complex warships requiring years to build. America had built and commissioned over 40 carriers in 2 years. This implied construction timelines of months, not years. It implied industrial capacity operating at scales that defied Japanese experience. Some intelligence officers suggested the reports were exaggerated. Perhaps American propaganda was inflating numbers, counting the same ships twice, or including vessels that were not truly operational. But reconnaissance confirmed the carriers existed. Radio intercepts identified them operating in multiple theaters simultaneously. Combat reports from Japanese forces engaged by American carrier aircraft verified their presence. The carriers were real, all of them. Admiral Osamu Nagano, chief of the Imperial Japanese Navy General Staff, reviewed intelligence summaries in his Tokyo headquarters in early 1944. The document listed American carrier strength: 8 pre-war carriers, though several had been sunk, 14 Essex-class carriers commissioned or commissioning, 9 Independence-class light carriers, over 40 escort carriers, additional Essex-class carriers under construction with commissioning dates throughout 1944. The total was approaching 70 carriers. Nagano understood what he was looking at. Japan had entered a war against an industrial power that operated under different rules than any nation in history. American shipyards were not building carriers the way Japan built carriers, or the way Britain built carriers, or the way any navy had ever built carriers. They were manufacturing them. The distinction was crucial. Traditional naval construction treated each ship as a unique project. Designs were refined, materials were custom fabricated, systems were installed and tested individually. American wartime construction had abandoned this approach. The Essex-class carriers were built using standardized components manufactured at facilities across the country. Turbines came from General Electric plants, armor plate rolled at steel mills in Pennsylvania, electrical systems assembled in factories that had made commercial generators, radar sets produced on assembly lines, gun mounts manufactured in batches of dozens. Everything was standardized, interchangeable, mass-produced. The carriers themselves were built in sections that could be fabricated simultaneously and then assembled. Newport News Shipbuilding, Brooklyn Navy Yard, Philadelphia Naval Shipyard, Fall River Shipyard, and Norfolk Navy Yard all built Essex-class carriers using identical plans and methods. Workers could transfer between yards and immediately understand the work because every ship was built the same way. The Independence-class light carriers were even more startling in their construction efficiency. The New York Shipbuilding Corporation in Camden, New Jersey, built all 9 Independence-class carriers in less than 2 years. The ships used Cleveland-class light cruiser hulls that were already under construction when the conversion program began. Instead of completing the cruisers, workers added flight decks, hangar spaces, and aviation systems. The hulls were already designed and partially built. The conversion required adding standardized components that were manufactured off-site and installed in assembly line fashion. Independence was laid down as a cruiser in May 1941, redesignated as a carrier in March 1942, and commissioned in January 1943. 20 months from initial construction to operational carrier, Princeton took 14 months from conversion decision to commissioning. The entire class of 9 carriers was completed in the time Japan typically needed to build one fleet carrier. The escort carriers represented the ultimate expression of American mass production applied to naval construction. Henry Kaiser, an industrialist who had never built ships before the war, created shipyards specifically designed for rapid construction of simple, standardized vessels. His yards built escort carriers on methods borrowed from automotive production. Casablanca-class escort carriers were built in an average of 3 months, from keel laying to launch. Vancouver, Washington, launched an escort carrier every 8 days at peak production. 50 Casablanca-class carriers were built in total, all to identical specifications, all using the same mass-produced components. These were not sophisticated warships. They were simple, functional platforms for aircraft operations, built quickly and cheaply. But they worked. Each could operate 28 aircraft. Each could protect convoys, support amphibious landings, or provide air cover for fleet operations. And there were dozens of them, with more launching every month. Japanese intelligence officers calculated the industrial capacity this production represented. Building 70 carriers required approximately 2.1 million tons of steel, assuming an average displacement of 30,000 tons per fleet and light carrier, and much less for escort carriers. American steel production in 1943 exceeded 80 million tons. Less than 3% of American steel output went to carrier construction. The carriers represented a minor allocation of resources in an economy producing ships, tanks, aircraft, trucks, and munitions in quantities that dwarfed anything Japan could achieve. More troubling was what the carrier production revealed about American shipbuilding capacity in general. If America could build 70 carriers in 3 years, what else were American shipyards building? Intelligence confirmed that American destroyer production exceeded 100 ships per year. Liberty ships, the mass-produced cargo vessels, were being built faster than German submarines could sink them. America launched over 2,000 Liberty ships during the war, each built in an average of 42 days. One Liberty ship, Robert E. Peary, was built in 4 days and 15 hours as a demonstration of American production capability. The entire ship, from keel laying to launch, in less than 1 week. This was not shipbuilding as Japan understood it. This was industrial production on a scale that had no historical precedent. Admiral Nagano faced the reality that Japan's naval strategy had been based on false assumptions. The assumption that carrier construction required years. The assumption that industrial capacity had practical limits that would constrain American production. the assumption that attrition warfare could work in Japan's favor. All were wrong. American industrial capacity was not just superior to Japan's, it was so superior that comparison was meaningless. Japan produced 6 fleet carriers during the entire war. America produced 24 Essex-class fleet carriers alone, with construction timelines of 14 to 20 months each. Japan built 5 smaller carriers. America built 9 Independence-class light carriers in less time than Japan built 1 fleet carrier. Japan converted 2 passenger liners into escort carriers. America built over 100 escort carriers, creating an entire category of naval vessel that existed purely because American industry could build ships faster than the military could find uses for them. The strategic implications were crushing. Every Japanese carrier sunk was irreplaceable. Taiho, completed in March 1944 after 3 years of construction, was the most advanced carrier Japan ever built. She was sunk by an American submarine in June 1944, 3 months after commissioning. Japan could not replace her. The shipyards were already building at maximum capacity, and material shortages constrained even that limited production. Meanwhile, American carriers sunk in combat were replaced within months by new construction already underway. When Princeton was sunk at Leyte Gulf in October 1944, 4 more Essex-class carriers were already fitting out. The loss barely registered in American carrier availability. Japanese naval leadership began receiving intelligence reports in late 1944 that defied comprehension. American carrier task forces operating simultaneously in multiple theaters. One task group hitting targets in the Philippines, while another struck Formosa, while a third supported operations at Iwo Jima. The Americans were operating carriers with such abundance that they could afford to disperse them across thousands of miles of ocean. Each group containing more carriers than Japan had operational in the entire Pacific. At the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944, Japan committed virtually its entire remaining carrier force to what was intended as a decisive engagement. 4 carriers, with minimal air groups because trained pilots were no longer available in sufficient numbers. The carriers served primarily as decoys, drawing American attention while Japanese battleships attempted to reach the landing beaches. The Americans engaged this force with overwhelming strength. Fast Carrier Task Force 38 alone contained 16 fleet and light carriers, 16 carriers in a single task force, more than double the number Japan could muster across its entire navy. The battle demonstrated that Japan had lost not just the quantitative advantage, but the qualitative advantage as well. American pilots were well-trained replacements who flew superior aircraft. F-6F Hellcats dominated the sky. TBF Avengers delivered devastating torpedo and bombing attacks. American carriers operated with sophisticated radar, efficient damage control, and logistical support that kept them operational despite damage. Japanese carriers by late 1944 were hollow shells. Zuikaku, the last surviving carrier from the Pearl Harbor attack, went to Leyte Gulf with an air group of largely inexperienced pilots flying obsolete aircraft. When American aircraft found the Japanese carriers, the slaughter was one-sided. All 4 Japanese carriers were sunk. Zuikaku, Zuiho, Chitose, and Chiyoda went to the bottom, carrying with them the last meaningful Japanese carrier capability. Japan would build no more fleet carriers. The resources were gone, the shipyards destroyed by American bombing, the trained workers scattered or drafted into the army. After Leyte Gulf, Japan possessed no operational fleet carriers. America possessed over 90, with more commissioning monthly. The final count, compiled after the war ended, showed that American shipyards built 141 carriers of all types between 1941 and 1945, 24 Essex-class fleet carriers, 9 Independence-class light carriers, 108 escort carriers of various classes. The Japanese count that had started with 8 American carriers in 1941 had grown to 141 by war's end, with the construction rate actually accelerating in 1944 and 1945 as American shipyards reached peak efficiency. Post-war interviews with Japanese naval officers revealed the psychological impact of this production disparity. Admiral Soemu Toyoda, who commanded the combined fleet in 1944, stated in interrogations that he had known by late 1943 that Japan could not win a war of attrition. The carrier production numbers made that mathematically certain, but the war continued because no alternative existed except surrender, which was politically impossible. Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, who planned the kamikaze attacks, explicitly designed that strategy around the reality that Japan could not match American carrier production. If conventional carrier versus carrier combat was impossible due to American numerical superiority, then suicide attacks offered the only method to inflict casualties the Americans might find unacceptable. The logic was desperate but rational given Japan's situation. American carriers were so numerous that trading one Japanese aircraft and pilot for one American carrier was actually favorable mathematics for Japan. The kamikaze strategy sank or damaged dozens of American carriers, but American shipyards simply built more. For every carrier damaged and sent back for repairs, 2 more arrived from American shipyards. The production advantage meant that even effective Japanese tactics could not change strategic reality. The story of Japanese admirals counting carriers contains a lesson that extended beyond naval warfare. Japan had entered the war believing that fighting spirit, tactical superiority, and strategic surprise could offset material disadvantages. The carrier production numbers proved this belief wrong in the most concrete way possible. Industrial capacity determined the war's outcome more than any single battle or tactical innovation. Germany learned this same lesson on the Eastern Front, where Soviet production of tanks and aircraft eventually overwhelmed German tactical excellence. Britain learned it in reverse, as American production capacity supplemented British industry and made victory possible. But Japan's experience was perhaps the most dramatic because the disparity was so visible and measurable. 8 carriers to 141, the numbers were undeniable. For American naval officers after the war, the carrier production program represented validation of decisions made years earlier to standardize designs and apply industrial methods to shipbuilding. The Essex-class carriers, built in large numbers to identical specifications, proved more valuable than smaller numbers of individually superior ships. Quantity had its own quality. The production achievement was remembered in post-war naval planning. When America designed subsequent carrier classes, production efficiency remained a priority. The Cold War supercarriers were more complex and took longer to build, but the principle of standardized series production endured. Modern Nimitz-class carriers were built in series of 10, using standardized components and methods derived from World War II experience. The Japanese admirals who counted 8 American carriers in 1941 and watched that count grow to 141 by 1945 witnessed the decisive advantage of industrial warfare. They planned for a war where steel and shipyards mattered less than courage and training. They discovered that modern war between industrial powers is fundamentally about production capacity. The side that can build more ships, more aircraft, more tanks, faster and in greater numbers, wins. Everything else is details. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.